Okay, we're going to make a start. Welcome, everyone, to the launch of the Routledge Handbook of Marxism and Post Marxism, edited by Alex Kalinikos, Stathis Kouvelakis, and Lucia Pradella. The handbook contains contributions from almost 60 authors and has been described by Michael Levy as an outstanding contribution to Marxist scholarship, and by Leah Ippy as an intelligent and erudite book that shows us not only how to read Marx, but also how to struggle against capitalism. I'm slightly paraphrasing. Sorry, I was muted. My name is Faizi Ismail, and I was also glad to have the opportunity to make a small contribution to this handbook with a chapter on Chandra Mohanty and Third World Feminism, and I'll be chairing this book launch. It's true what people have said about the urgency of such a book, in that it reinforces the relevance of Marxism, not only to understanding the world at this current historical conjuncture of multiple crises, but the relevance of Marxism in providing the most rigorous framework and method to address and overcome these crises. As the introduction to the handbook outlines, perhaps one of the most significant contributions of Marx's critique of political economy was that it had an organic connection to the working class, and that for Marx, a practical critique of the existing system was crucial. And so it's deeply important that such a book is widely read and used to inform our analyses of politics beyond academia. Alex Kalinikos is Emeritus Professor of European Studies at King's College London, and is the author of many books, including Imperialism and Global Political Economy. He will introduce the handbook for around 10 minutes, and then we will hear from Gayatri Chakraborty-Spivak, who, as we know, teaches at Columbia University and has contributed to the handbook with a chapter on global Marx. And then we'll hear from Trevor Ngwane, who is a socialist and activist from South Africa and has recently written a book on grassroots democracy in South African shack settlements, Amakomiti. They will each speak for 15 to 20 minutes, and then we will take short contributions from the floor, including from contributors to the handbook. So at that point, you can post your questions in the chat. So I'll call on Alex to introduce.
Thanks very much, Faizi, and hello, everyone. It's great to see so many people, including many friends from around the world. I want to start with a slightly darker note, because we're meeting in terrible times, which have been taking a toll among the Marxists and socialists around the world. And I just want to mention two who are no longer with us. Ed Rooksby, a former student of mine who died at a ridiculously young age over the weekend, and Mick Brooks, a veteran British socialist whose memorial meeting I've just been attending. We need to remember these people as those who've helped to build the tradition, which certainly I am trying to continue. Now, as that reference to the sad events that are unfolding around us indicates, we live in a world that is very different from the one when the handbook was conceived 5.5 years ago. It took a long time to bring it to fruition and a lot of effort. And I'm grateful to everyone who has contributed to that. Today, we live in a world where we're confronted, as Faizi said, with multiple crises. The economic crisis that really began in 2007-8 and that continues in a more acute form today. There's the biological crisis, which is a consequence to a very large extent of capitalism's increasing destruction of nature. And then there's the political crisis, summed up, I think, by the assault on the Capitol in Washington on the 6th of January. We got a sudden existential blow that made us aware of the extent of the threat from the far right today. And I would say that these crises, terrible though they are in their combination, vindicate the project that that the handbook represents, because we sought to present a diverse and militant Marxism in dialogue with other currents. Hence, it's a handbook of Marxism and Post Marxism, which Dr. Spivak represents in such a distinguished way. We wanted to challenge the myth that Marx was Eurocentric and that he wasn't interested in issues such as race, gender, and ecology. And in a key chapter called Foundation, Lucia wrote about Marx himself and showed how his critique of political economy was a critique of capitalism as a global system, inherent in which was imperialism and racism, and that the anti-colonial struggles that were developing in Marx's days were central to his conception of how capitalism would be ended. Our aim was more broadly to decenter Marxism. That's why, for example, there's a section called Tricontinental, which includes a range of thinkers, very diverse range, for whom Marxism was a tool in the struggle against imperialism, racism, and gender oppression. So we have figures like Lenin, like Connolly, like Maria Tegui, like Mao, like C.L.R. James, like Frantz Fanon, like Angela Davis, like Huey Newton, like Chandra Mohanty. We wanted to give a sense of the range, the internationalism, and the intransigent opposition to the present system in all its aspects. We chose to do this through a series of long contextual essays plus shorter entries on individual thinkers, or mainly on individual thinkers. We thought this was better than concentrating on themes and concepts, because you can bring out the specificity of individual thinkers better if you look at their distinctive problematics, not just, let's say, fetishism, but how Lukács deals with fetishism, Adorno, whoever. But there's a vulnerability that arises in this way of doing it. First of all, you can be criticized for whom you include and in particular whom you exclude. Maybe it's a sign of the strength of a handbook to the extent to which it's criticized for those it's forced to leave out. But also, if you're covering a range of thinkers who you think is essential, you have to wait on, sometimes for a long time, on the different contributors to deliver. And this is one reason why it took so long for the handbook to come out from when it was initially commissioned at the beginning of 2016. There was one happy result of the delay, which was that it meant that in the spring of 2020, we could, at the encouragement of Routledge, the publishers, add an extra final section on Marx in an age of catastrophe. And I think that, in a way, the world has developed, allowed us to synthesize what we were saying in the handbook in a way that we wouldn't have been able to otherwise. I'm very grateful to John Bellamy Foster and Intan Suwandi for providing a very substantial analysis of the COVID-19 pandemic, applying the Marxist critique of capitalism and imperialism to illuminate the pandemic that makes that final section. But through that, we were able to show that Marx inaugurated a tradition for which catastrophe, in other words, not, as one French communist once said, the tomorrows that sing, the glorious future, but catastrophe is an intrinsic part of Marx's thinking, and that Marxism, particularly through the kind of ecological Marxism represented, for example, by John Bellamy Foster and that Camilla Royal wrote about in the handbook, Marxism, particularly through this ecological tradition, can help us to understand why we're in the grip of this age of catastrophe, as I think we have to call the present, that was announced not just by the pandemic, but by the floods and fires that we see around the world, from Beira in Mozambique to San Francisco last year. Moreover, there are classical Marxist thinkers like Trotsky and Gramsci that provide us with the intellectual tools that we need to understand what is called in a superficial way populism, but that is really the rise of the most dangerous far right that we've seen since the interwar period, with an increasingly aggressive and assertive fascist fringe. Now, it's always good. This is such a long process that at the end you can look back and wonder about what you could have done better. And what self-criticisms would I make? These are my personal criticisms. I'm not saying Stathis or Lucia would agree with them. First of all, I think it's maybe a bit too biased towards high theory. You know, the grand figures like Adorno and Althusser and so on and so forth, both of whom I love. I'm not dismissing them, but maybe there should have been more an edge of activism to there, because Marxism, as Stacey said, is about the unity of theory and practice. But also, I think maybe, I don't think we went far enough in our aim of diversifying Marxism. Lucius said not long ago that we should have included an entry on W.E. Du Bois. And when she said it, it was too late to do anything about it. I kicked myself. Because Du Bois's Black Reconstruction in America is, I think, one of the great Marxist classics, in its way comparable to, let's say, Trotsky's History of the Russian Revolution or James's Black Jacobins. It's a marvelous work that combines structure, process, and agency in the most brilliant and compelling way. And in the book, Du Bois says something that is very relevant to our present situation. He said, here is the real modern labor problem. Out of the exploitation of the dark proletariat comes a surplus value filched from human breasts, which in cultured lands, the machines and harness power veil and conceal. The emancipation of man, it should have, that is something we would need to change. The emancipation of human beings is the emancipation of labor, and the freeing of labor is the freeing of that basic majority of workers who are yellow, brown, and black. Now, I think that speaks very powerfully to the present when we think about who has been victimized most cruelly by the pandemic and by all the other mechanisms of racism and repression that operate in the world today. But it's important, and this is one of Marx's most important insights, to see this dark proletariat not just as victims, but as agents. Agents not just of resistance to what has happened, is happening, but also agents of liberation from this world with all its cruelties. And that's the basic insight that the Marxism that we explore in the handbook is providing. I'll leave it there.
Thanks so much, Alex. That's great, and that's perfect timing. Okay, so we'll now hear from Gayatri Chakravorty-Spivak.
Hello, thank you very much for asking me to do this. It's a bit terrifying. And good morning, afternoon, and good evening to all of you. Yes, Alex, we are in a time of unbelievable crisis, and both in my country of citizenship, India, and my country of residence, United States. So it ain't just the 6th of February in the United States. India is also going slowly into a theocratic hell. Anyway, the notice says we will discuss how to learn to use Marx in a world in turmoil. I cannot do a how-to. I'm very much hoping Trevor can. I will say a few things in 20 minutes about how I have been learning from my mistakes facing a world in turmoil as best I can. A world in turmoil. It is a relief map. Many different diachronies, historical narratives, have come together by the grace of the silicon chip into one synchrony, one contemporaneity, one modernity. Everything is modern. Marx had predicted this. Arunoday Mukherjee always look for caste in an Indian name. Even if they're now politically correct, as indeed am I, they have millennially received massive historical advantages. This is partly why I can't do a how-to. Anyway, this nice young man said on BBC World News yesterday morning that India was a huge e-commerce market with matching statistics. Of course, you can't tell when exactly he said it. Loop News is an allegory. Read symbolic if you're irritated by POMO. Loop News is an allegory of the false level playing field in the place of our wild relief map promised by globalization. If you wish to see what happens when an official map, here Israel, is, quote, opened up into its texture, see Tariq Sidi, Grandfather's Path, by Nizar Hassan. Incidentally, the documentary also brings up the initial admiration of and desire to collaborate with the colonizers. Here's a great distinction between slavery and colonialism, and also this to acknowledge complicity for those of us who are from post-colonial nations, so-called, is extremely important so that we don't think pointing fingers that everything began with the play of capital and colony. Here's Nizar Hassan.
الصهيوني لمنتزه حطوا يافطة بتقول إنها كانت قرية بيزنطية. وجود العرب فيها بالنسبة لهم محض صدفي وأصلا بالغلط. لا بذكر سيدي ولا يحزنون، لا بيجيبوا سيرة العرب ولا سيرته. ذكرت سروني بكتب الرحالة الأوروبيين وبخرايطهم سنة 1829 و 1857. كان عدد سكانها لما خلق سيدي يقدر ب 250 نسمة بحسب إحصائيات جمعية استكشاف فلسطين البريطانية. أما حسب إحصائيات الإمبراطورية العثمانية بنفس الفترة فكان عددهم 300. يقال أيضاً أن أرض صاروني كانت ملك لمفتي الناصري وباع عام 1909 قسم كبير منها للجمعية اليهودية لاستعمار فلسطين وسوريا. صاروني لمنتزه.
Here now is the complicity.
الألمان هنا نساء ورجال صحاح الأجسام. معاصر القول أنه لا ريب بأن هذا النسل العامل هو أرقى طبقة في حيفا، سواء كان باعتبار معيشته أو ثروته أو علمه أو معرفته. يقول أن الأقضية الأخرى عبارة عن مجاري مياه مفتوحة وحمارة يملؤون الماء منها وقرى قذرة وصبيان يلعبون بالتراب وهم حفاة عراة قد سترتهم طبقات من الذباب. طلع إن الكتلة الإسلامية في حيفا هي أحط الطبقات وأضعفها من جهة الحياة الاجتماعية، وإن أحط
This is his grandfather, whom he adores, but we have to acknowledge that there was this collaboration almost everywhere. And yet, given this wildly unequal subjectship, the task is still and persistently to generate a general will for social justice, minimally defined as the willingness to turn capital away from capitalism to diversified social good. A minimal definition is needed because it must travel into the bottom of the relief map, among people who are illiterate or ill-educated, yet not necessarily lacking in intelligence or imagination. Typically, when we think tricontinental, subaltern, and post-colonial studies, we think in terms of nation states. But think Syria, think Yemen, think of the war camps in the Middle East and Kashmir, think of the migrants in capsizing boats heading toward Europe. In a panel at the Modern Language Association in January, we will try to define the Rohingya as stateless. Angela Davis has tentatively agreed to think of the world's incarcerated as stateless, and a physicist who has been tirelessly working for the nuclear-tested Marshall Islanders will seek to define the terrain of nuclear testing as stateless. How can we even penetrate to, quote, use Marx, unquote, in these areas? My access is only to a bit of Kwara State in Nigeria, a bit of Accra, Ghana, a bit of Dakar, Senegal, a bit of Buenos Aires, a past experience in Hawaii, all for 10 or 11 to 20 years, and my 33 years of training teachers in subaltern rural areas of Western West Bengal. My minimal definition of, quote, subaltern is Gramsci's formula, quote, social groups in the margins of history. I focus on greed, lobh in Bengali, as a basic affect. Thus, Professor Margaret Macmillan, great-granddaughter of Lloyd George, in her Wreath lecture, and I quote, these affects, greed, violence, fear, do, of course, drive capitalism's dark side, a side that most of us can afford not to notice. In spite of all its terrible problems, my area of work in West Bengal was liberated by the Communist Party Marxist, CPM. I am walking with an elderly man to see his ecological produce in his pocket handkerchief of a plot loaned him by the man he sharecrops for. A member of the rural gentry gives me a namaskar. My companion says to me, Didi, sister, you see the sandals on my feet? When I was young, that man's father would have snatched them from my feet. I'm an untouchable. How dare I wear sandals? And would then have whipped me good and hard. How did this change? Asked I, shocked. Party, Didi, said he. So they know Pujibad, capitalism, is bad because it extracts munafa, profit, and the landless peasants remain poor. They fight for the party, but their own desire is to make money. I hope I am supplementing there B.R. Ambedkar's lack of confidence in a sense of democracy in the Indian social structure. Take a look at his interview with BBC.
Dr. Ambedkar, do you think democracy is going to work in India? No. Except for formal things, if you want. What do you mean? Or the real, I mean the paraphernalia of democracy, simultaneous elections, prime ministers, and so on and so on. Well, but elections are very important. No. Elections are important provided they produce really good men. But aren't they important because they're allowed to change the government? I mean, it's better to change peaceably than violently. Yes, but who has got the idea, you see, that voting means change of government? Nobody has. People have no consciousness. And our electoral system, you see, is of a sort which never allows the man to choose the candidate. Not, for instance, the Congress then to say, vote for what? Vote for Bullock. Yes, isn't it? Yes. Well, the man never cared who represented the Bullock. Though it was a donkey who represented the Bullock, you see, or a very educated man who represented the Bullock, he simply voted for the Bullock. Well, that's coming to me a party system. But what you mean by, in a formal sense, you mean that in a fundamental sense, democracy will not work. For the simple reason, we have got a social structure which is totally incompatible with parliamentary democracy. What do you mean that it's based on equality, inequality, or it is based on inequality? And therefore, unless you can get rid of the caste system, you don't think social structure got to be altered. I'm quite prepared to say, well, it will take some time for the social structure to be altered if you want to do it in a peaceful way. Yes, you see?
Well, I tried an extra moral lesson in desiring social justice with my teachers and supervisors this way. The task of devising a pedagogy to insert the children into the intuitions of democracy. Since they vote, they must learn that democracy is other people through habit of mind, although they are themselves dirt poor. This is another intellectual problem where I must learn how to step away from competitive knowledge, which I inhabit at Columbia. So I bring up an old proverb with my supervisors and teachers. We, myself and my co-workers, I say to them, have money, so we can be morally outraged. But it is understandable that you, who have never had money, and now through being educated, you can make money and want money, you cannot be faulted. But you do know the proverb, I say to them, Lobhe paap, pape mrityu, sin in greed, death in sin. Yes? Yes, they say. So, should we stop being greedy? Yes, they say. No, say I. We would fail. I'm greedy too. I like money. Let me rewrite the proverb for you. Lobhe labh, aker labhe oneker mrityu. Profit in greed. One person's profit brings death to many. Keep what you need, but use the rest for greater good. I changed the proverb for them, but must follow this up in every conversation to see if the desire to restrain greed is taking hold. For the smartest among them, who was chosen by CPM to run for the Panchayat, local self-government elections, and could not file his nomination papers because the party in power threatened to harm his family, he has taken a bank loan, bought a printer, and basically running an ATM for the local illiterates under COVID, and running an online business in makeup, etc. Yet he has never seen a plane or an airport, and I must remain on his case. Although the party tells them about capitalism and profit, no one has explained to them the theft of surplus value that Alex quoted Du Bois as mentioning that this is the basic thing. No one has explained to them the theft of surplus value in the simplest minimal definition, perhaps because there are no factories in the area. As I learn how to make Marxist convictions, rather than simply solving their own problems, infect their minds, I see what travels. And the theft of surplus value is one of them. As I wrote in the essay included in the handbook, I quote myself, Rick Wolf has taught us how to go back and back and back along the chain of the promises of security in securitized and unsecuritized debts. We once again arrive at the fact of the theft of surplus value that allows capitalism to flourish, end of quote. I want to dwell on this a little bit to show the range. In 1978, when I began teaching at the University of Texas at Austin, I was told by 13 students, undergraduates, that they wanted to read Marx. I said that I was hired by the English department. So they asked me to propose a course on Victorian nonfiction prose. They said, you put in the usual Carlyle and Matthew Arnold, etc. But then when you start teaching, teach Marx, they will all drop, but we will be there. Teaching Marx by this ruse. When I taught the basic thing about the theft of surplus value, a student from accountancy asked in anguish, why hasn't anyone taught us this? It made me realize how important it was to notice this basic fact. Primitive accumulation, in a broad and minimal definition, the work of the capitalization of land, the simplest definition of, quote, originary or primitive accumulation, making way for full-fledged industrial capitalism offered by Marx, now with direct access to the world market, also travels to the subaltern voter. That work is far from finished. The Amazon forest is, of course, the greatest example. Closer to home, accessible to my activist experience, is the example of Ghana and Nigeria and the agriculture of West Bengal. I am very much hoping that Joseph Oduro Frimpong and Oluwaseun Akinfenwa, among my co-workers in Africa, have had the time and the internet to watch this discussion. In West Bengal, the poorest sharecropping farmers are being tempted by localized nationalism by the Hindu Nationalist Party. Tempted by localized call in a language native to West Bengal, but not to the central state. So in a bad accent, which the locals will, even the illiterate peasants, I hope will notice. Ak mutho chal, a handful of rice. Shono bhai chashi, listen brother peasant. These are the things that the BJP has learned to say to come into the villages. This is an example of insertion into globalized capital. I have been able to explain this to my teachers and supervisors. They know that the illiterate farmers will not be able to understand. So these subalterns on the way to citizenship, my supervisors and teachers, they must explain to the illiterate farmers that the first promise of money will not be kept. Generally, the party bosses do not know how to talk to the rural subalterns. It is necessary to take the time to learn if you want to use Marx. The agency is in the hands of the teachers and supervisors, themselves a generation from illiteracy, landless. They will represent the global as local. Bangla Bachao, save Bengal's life. That's not the issue, but that's what the illiterate peasants will understand. Arundhati Roy, in a lovely interview with BBC World, keeps the problem confined to India. No, this is a global problem. And indeed, she keeps it confined to Delhi. She reminds us correctly that it began in the 60s when the so-called, quote, Green Revolution, pretty much selling agriculture to Monsanto and Cargill, put the lid on, quote, Red Revolution. This I have been able to share with the Dalits I work for. A left of center friend argues for free trade and still thinks only of India. By placing price control in the hands of the corporate sector, land capitalization is now being directly inserted into global capital. There is much to say about this, but I will simply mention Disha Ravi, who has been detained for sharing documents as a key conspirator. What conspiracy is there? And I will add that all global movement against land grab connects in this struggle against primitive accumulation, even to reverse it. For a citation, I will give you Land Back, a Yellowhead Institute red paper, which is about, I quote, about reclaiming indigenous jurisdiction, breathing life into rights and responsibilities, and the planting of rice again in the Nigerian savannas, which is being undermined by African capitalism. Planting of rice again in the Nigerian savannas, where the planters are mostly women who have no concept of Nigeria, as indeed the illiterate peasants don't of West Bengal. And they speak the unsystematized native languages of Africa, which are extremely powerful, but of course unrecognized by the development workers for whom the wealth of language is a problem because they are basically monolingual capitalists. The local branch of the party, on the other hand, want to join up, the local branch in West Bengal. The local branch of the party, on the other hand, want to join up in the hope that later they can build themselves back up again. How do I know this? From these teachers and supervisors. And it is the subalterns partially on the way to citizenship that are beginning to meet to teach them better. I have been learning then that in order to use Marx for accessing the global, we must think the citizen rather than the worker as the agent of Marxism. I got the idea first from W.E.B. Du Bois, the study of Black Reconstruction and the Civil War amendments, 13, 14, 15. The pulverizing of the factory floor, this phrase comes from Asia Labor Monitor, and the hostility to outsourcing, as well as the collaboration between labor and management, makes labor vulnerable today in many ways, and in supplementing vanguardism and organizing to promote class consciousness, a collective international striving must travel from absolute hands-on detail, learning to rearrange desires, to the generalizations of policy. By supplement is meant breaking open a totality to fill a hole in it, and even introducing the incalculable. Black Lives Matter, in its demand for full access to citizenship, with its acknowledgement of the incalculability of the trans subject, is such a supplement to obstinate Eurocentric clamor for correct summaries of Marxist doctrines. The lesson of COVID is redistributing to essential workers, highly gendered in different ways. In other words, socialism. It is also for human beings to behave thinking about other people, namely democracy, democratic socialism. I'm a New Yorker, need I say more? But we fight against the sentimentalization, capitalization, or policyfication only of this lesson. I'm not against policy, but policy enforces. Our struggle, learning from the emergence of bad capitalism in Russia and capitalism in China, is to transform enforcement into a desire for social justice, persistently supplementing democratic socialism in an extra-moral way. This is not a moralist argument. I have not yet been able to learn how to make climate change behavior internalized by the subaltern groups I work for. I cannot discuss this for lack of time, but the issues around climate change are also sentimentalized and capitalized by the corporate sector, corporate social responsibility helping sustainable underdevelopment. I'm speaking in riddles now, hoping to expand in the Q&A. But I find an acceptance of working for the future, for the work might not finish in our lifetime, among these subalterns. No anxiety about deliverables here. They can move with Marx's idea of the realm of freedom beyond social engineering. They can even move with the content of revolution being the poetry of the future, although, quote, poetry remains somewhat elite. It has been suggested that the subaltern accesses the public sphere by bringing religion into crisis. I believe Ambedkar was at work learning the mindset of his fellow Dalits across class lines by becoming a Buddhist, although he did not live long enough to implement this epistemological change. Siddhartha Gautama, being a prince, had access to the refined language, the word Sanskrit, of course, meaning refined. But he chose to do his preaching and his discourse in the language of the common people, which was not acknowledged. In one generation, his spirit was destroyed. Everything was translated into Sanskrit, and we had the Mahayana Buddhism that moved to Korea and China and so on, and Theravada Buddhism, which in Pali became a heavily ritualized, magnificent but ritualized Tibetan religion, almost polytheist. I will end with a word about disability. Yesterday on a BBC item on astronaut recruitment, we heard, I quote, in terms of space travel, we are all disabled. I have suggested that the subject is always disabled. We start living and dying when we are born. Rather than consider the trans disabled, the people of color disabled, women disabled, the aged disabled, the illiterate disabled in casting a normal vote, we should learn to think that this, within brackets, Disability is ability. This may be Pomo, but I need those brackets, Terry. You remember Terry Eagleton deciding that this type of typographic play made my work like a Pakistani supermarket. I hesitate to use the R word. No, the brackets signify an invitation to mind change. Acknowledge that normal is a methodological necessity that must set aside the acknowledgement of general disability, so-called, in order to keep making decisions. If citizenship is the new site of agency in a global capitalist world full of turmoil, the normal subject cannot be the male capitalist subject in an extended prime of life. Thank you for listening. I cut myself off here. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Gayatri, for those insights. So next we'll hear from Trevor Ngwane. Trevor, are you there?
I'm here. Thank you very much. It's an honor to be on this panel. Thanks to the organizers, to Gayatri Spivak, and to everyone who's logged on to listen to this discussion. So firstly, I want to congratulate the editors of the book and the authors, the contributors. It is a great book. It calls itself a handbook. And indeed, I would call it a Marxist user's manual. It is a handbook insofar as it holds your hand as you walk through the complex terrain of the development of Marxist theory and the emergence of post-Marxism, especially during the 20th century. It is a good introduction to this body of literature, and also it serves as a good refresher course for those who have heard it all and seen it all before, because there's a freshness in the way the debates are presented and revisited, and also there's a subtle but unmistakable grounding in today's realities, concerns, and sensibilities. And it also looks at key debates among and between Marxists and post-Marxists, showing the convergences and divergences. It's a long book. 46 chapters are dedicated to specific authors. You know, I think Comrade Alex mentioned them. I'll add Angela Davis, Frantz Fanon, Wallerstein. It's a treasure trove. Also, there are 10 chapters that introduce and frame the issues and the historical periods. So in sum, it's a great read. It's a must read. Now, comrades, this book comes at a time when humanity faces many challenges, which the previous speakers have commented or mentioned. COVID-19, climate change, the rich getting richer, right-wing populism, etc. Now, as Friedrich Engels once wrote, our theory, Marxism, is not a dogma, but a guide to action. So the question which I want to ask today is, to what extent can Marxism inform our response to the challenges facing humanity today? The second question, which arises from the book, the handbook, what insights can we get from post-Marxism? And of course, maybe a third question, what can we learn from the interaction and the debates between Marxism and those we can call as falling or see as falling under the post-Marxism camp? So this book is a very good starting point in answering these questions. Chapter 1, you know, it's written by one of the editors, Lucia Pradella. It's titled Foundation, Karl Marx, 1880 to 1883. So today it is 138 years since Karl Marx died. But I think the theoretical foundation he set remains unshakable, because the truth is capitalism rests on the private ownership of the bosses and the exploitation of workers. The ruling class benefits, the working class suffers, and all the allied classes, the subalterns, which Gayatri was talking about. Chapter 2 of the handbook is on Friedrich Engels, written by Roland Boer. So it notes the research conducted by Engels, which culminated in his book, The Condition of the Working Class in England, where Engels mapped out the suffering of the laboring classes under the early capitalist system. But one thing important about Marx and Engels, the founders, so to speak, for them, the working class were not just victims of the capitalist bosses. You know, for Marxism, the working class is the revolutionary subject, something which I think Gayatri is grappling with. Or was grappling with. The working class is the class of producers. So everything we see, you know, has been produced by the hands of workers or by machines made by the hands of workers. Yes, a lot has changed. There are technological developments. There is talk of a new economy, the fourth industrial revolution. But I think the working class, the producers, remain central to the operation of capitalism. Production is in the hands of the working class. It does not matter how much there is a gig economy, or how much work is online, or how many tasks can be automated. There has to be production even to allow these things to happen. There has to be food, there has to be power, you know, construction, distribution, clothes, water. People in the gig economy need these things. People working online need these things. People busy engineering automation need these basic things. So we can still, in any case, pose the question, has capitalism changed since Marx and Engels observed it and wrote about it? Now, Marx said capitalism is a dynamic system. And he said its technological changes are breathtaking and will be breathtaking. Remember that famous, slightly dramatic sentence, all that is solid melts into air. All that is holy is profaned. So Marx knew that this system, you know, is a changing monster. So the handbook, the book we're discussing today, explains the birth of post-Marxism by reference to these changes. So, for example, there's a chapter on Frederick Jameson, you know, written by Robert T. Taylor Jr. So Jameson argues that the questioning of Marxism by Marx, by the post-Marxists, or the questioning of the Marxian paradigm arises when capitalism seems to change its spots, when it seems to, you know, acquire new attributes. So now, in response, you know, for example, Fanon, because of his situation in Algeria, fighting colonialism, fighting the French bourgeoisie, he felt that we have to stretch Marxism in order to make sense of the situation here. Others get that temptation, a strong temptation, to conclude that the paradigm itself has been overtaken and outmoded, and that we need new theories. So in a way, what we're saying here and what the handbook tells me is that, you know, Marxism itself, because it's a guide to action, will change. Post-Marxisms and even anti-Marxism emerge in relation to changes in the system, you know, be it technology, be it the class structure, be the geographic reach of the system as it leaves that little corner, small corner Marx talked about with Engels and spread throughout the world to even the place where I'm sitting in Johannesburg. So this helps us to understand, the dynamism of the theorization and even the challenges to the theorization. Of course, also capitalism is experienced, where you are along national dimensions, race, gender, etc. So those are the issues which we are grappling with. And I think those are some of the issues Comrade Spivak was raising. So I think that the handbook in its various chapters deals very well and in very specific ways with each of the various post-Marxisms, it tries to address in response to these questions. So you get questions like post-capitalism, post-industrialism, it's all about changes which people are grappling to make sense of. But I want to say that it seems to me, and I think probably I'm on the same wavelength with the editors of the book, it seems to me that the structural dynamics of capitalism have not changed much. Capital accumulation, the drive to make profits, the generation of surplus value, the exploitation of the working class, etc. So, in fact, to me, there's more continuity than discontinuity. And even the variation and differentiation, some of which Comrade Gayatri was talking about, the unemployed, those who unemployed workers, those who never worked, because capitalism, capital, creates, unemployed workers, but it also creates unemployed workers. Capitalism can sometimes work, like the old imperialist armies, the British Army in the Anglo-Boer War, here in South Africa. It can be experienced as a scorched earth policy, where there's development over there, skyscrapers going up, but in some sections of the world, in some parts of the world, or some parts of a country, nothing is happening. It's just doom and gloom. So all that is because of how the system develops. It's part of the dynamic of the system. That is why I say that there is more continuity than discontinuity. Now, of course, some post-Marxists, because they vary, people like Angela Davis, some people have called them post-Marxists, but they still work within, they try to relate, to the Marxist paradigm. But others, take it a step further, like Laclau and Mouffe, and then others, declare Marxism dead. So my point here is that often when Marxism is declared dead or old hat, this often means the working class is also declared dead or irrelevant. So there is a problem here. If the producers in a system of production are declared irrelevant, if their power, at least their potential power as the people who make the system work is not recognized, if the power is not strategized about or around, if that power is not activated, then I don't think we're going to have a strong way forward fighting that system and its effects. In other words, it doesn't mean that the possibilities are not there. It just means that there are obstacles that are put in the way of fighting against a system. So an example, we see a lot of anger and frustration. We see protest movements, even strikes. But the question is, especially if we look at it from the point of view of the working class, of the masses who are victims of capital, will the angry and frustrated workers have hope? Will the anger be enriched by hope and vision of building something different? Will there be a vision of alternatives in the midst of that anger? A vision of real solutions? Now, I think that if workers don't have hope, don't have confidence in themselves, firstly as producers, in their power together to fight behind their needs, for their needs, it's not that a vacuum is left. What happens is that competitiveness, suspicion takes over. Individualism occupies that space. In fact, a political hopelessness, a hopelessness in politics is the result when there is no hope, when there is no self-confidence. Now, workers need anger and hope to move forward, fighting for their needs. But where can that hope come from if that hope is trampled upon again and again? So, I would say anything and everything which promotes that crisis of confidence, which undermines the hope of a different world, is not just a partial or part of the system, it is a part of the problem. Because workers fight best behind a vision of alternatives, behind the dream of a different future, a better future. And sometimes this is something we learned here when we're fighting against apartheid, during the 80s. Sometimes what we need and what we had was clear knowledge and vision about how the only solution for workers, indeed for humanity and for nature, is to overthrow capitalism. So that clear vision becomes buried, by the mark of bourgeois thinking. And I might say, in relation to workers' organizations, by the politics of class collaboration, what Comrade Alex would call the politics of reformism. So when workers are not allowed to dream, or when their dream is made small, the dream becomes infested, diseased. So the retreat from the big dream of something different, of a system beyond capitalism, the struggle or theorizations against the totalizing vision, the preference by certain theoreticians, strategists, even within the working class, for fragmented solutions, for localism, the small dream, the small vision, I think it's a problem. Because usually, that is linked to a denial of the power of the working class as a class, not only in one country, but as an international force against a totalizing capitalist system. So anything which makes workers less likely to see their own power, anything that undermines workers' confidence in themselves, that divides them up, whether along racial, gender, whatever lines, anything that makes them not realize their power to change history as producers or as allied, as family members, as comrades, as compatriots of those, who produce, such as the unemployed workers, such as the peasants, those theories, those strategies are not different parts of a solution. They are part of the problem. They don't open up new possibilities. They are obstacles. So I think that it is possible and necessary to have theories that support the development of hope and confidence and collective struggle of the working class and of the masses, of those suffering under the book, the jackboot of capitalism. So to conclude, I would say that, yes, we live in difficult times, as we've mentioned, COVID-19, climate change, rich getting richer, whatever. Rosa Luxemburg she's got a chapter there in that book, someone is dealing with her, said the choice facing humanity is between socialism or barbarism. So the question today is there a moment of possibility in the middle of that barbarism, you know? So this is the idea that the writer Arundhati Roy was trying to convey when she wrote that inspiring piece, The Pandemic is a Portal, where she said, historically, pandemics have forced humans to break with the past and imagine their world anew. This one is no different. It is a portal, a gateway between one world and the next. So comrades, friends, colleagues, austerity, climate change, job cuts, these attacks, all of them, they come from the same enemy, you know, the bosses and their governments. They are attacks against victims who belong to the same class or who belong to the same mass of people, you know, who struggle under misery and hardship of the system. These people, it doesn't matter that they are in different organizations, they are in different countries, they are of different races, different sexes, sexual orientations, in different continents even. So because they all suffer against the jackboot of capital, you know, because they have the same enemy, you know, the basis is there for the needs, for their needs, you know, for their struggles. The basis is there that we can develop a unifying set of demands so that in the midst of the barbarism, there is a moment of possibility. So as much as we struggle with immediate issues of everyday life, you know, we have to take the lesson of history, which is there in the book, you know, repeated again and again in place after place. And that lesson is that the struggle of everyday life will be pushed back without a vision of building a different power. This is what I think the handbook underlines, you know, and I really congratulate the editors and all those who contributed to writing this great book. Thank you very much, comrades.
Thank you so much, Trevor. That was inspiring. That's excellent. So you can keep posting your questions in the chat. Some of the things that have come out from what's been discussed so far are around the structural dynamics of capitalism, whether these have changed, whether there's more continuity than change, and of course the centrality of the working class as an agent of change. I think both speakers have spoken to that. I just want to ask if there perhaps are 2 or 3 contributors, people who have written chapters that want to say a couple of things, 2 or 3 minutes each, and then I'll take a few questions from the chat, and then we can go back to some of the contributors. So if any of the contributors would like to raise their hands, you can speak for 2 minutes, and I'll just do that when you've got 2 minutes, when you've done 2 minutes, and then you can start to wrap up, just so we can get as many contributions and questions as possible. So yeah, I can see John Molyneux's hand, but actually I'm not even sure if John is a contributor. Lucia will know whether John is a contributor.
No, I'm not. I just put my hand up.
I hope to take you later, John, but I know that Kieran Allen is a contributor, so I'll take Kieran first, and then if somebody else wants to put up their hand, you're most welcome. So Kieran. Kieran, are you there?
Sorry. A lot of emphasis has been placed on, the issue of the age of catastrophe. I want to stress, I think that it is also an age of revolt, starting with, for example, the farmers in India, stretching to Lebanon, stretching to the Black Lives Matter movement. And therefore the challenge for Marxists is how they relate to this huge level of revolt, which by the way is happening now before COVID breaks, and God knows what will happen after COVID. And what I want to really emphasize is really the danger for me is a notion that Marxism is confined to the universities, and that we have waiting, somehow we're in a state of waiting until the organized working class, or rather an idealized version of the organized working class, appears to become the agent of change. I don't see it like that. I think that, first of all, in the type of crisis we're in, faced with the failure of social democracy and of Stalinism, which is, if you like, wreaked terrible hardship on working class politics, I think we'll find much more complex events happening. Namely, people can revolt politically before they revolt industrially. People can look to Jeremy Corbyn or to Bernie Sanders before they start taking strike action. Peasants can move before workers. Community action can take place before factory action. And therefore, for me, the crucial thing for Marxists is to be creative and to understand that we have to take Marxism out of the universities into whatever transitional spaces that allow real existing working people who want to revolt to begin to go on a journey. And the contribution for Marxists is precisely to have that creativity to be able to relate to transitional type organizations, rather than just simply Marxists being by themselves in a vanguard organization. We have to learn how to relate to the revolts that are happening today. And for me, the crucial thing is being part of a transitional organization that has people who are left reformists, people who are revolutionaries, but the contribution that Marxists will make is to go on a journey with those people to convince them patiently that the aim is to overthrow capitalism by means of revolution. But we'll only do that if we're part of those wider movements.
Thanks so much, Kieran. So next I'll take Royal.
Hi, thanks, Tracy. My name's Camilla. As Alex very kindly mentioned, I wrote the little bit on ecological Marxism. We had to kind of change it and add to it a little bit because since conceiving of this book, there have been not only natural disasters, but also some quite radical and, to me, inspiring environmental movements. But what I wanted to mention was I was quite interested in some of the points in the chat, and I'm sure other people will speak as well, but there's a point about what kind of project Marxism is, and is it a project of modernity? And I would say no. To me, modernity is founded on a separation of humanity and nature. I mean, at least that's what Latour and others would describe it as. I think Marxism. I think Marx's project is very different from that. It's they talk about, Marx and Engels talk about, the first premise of human history is the existence of living human individuals. First fact to be established, physical organization of these individuals and their consequent relation to the rest of nature. So it's a project that starts from humans as part of nature, a differentiated part, but still part of it, and that doesn't see the issue of nature as something somehow separate from the economic system that we live in. So this is kind of, I think this is why we call it ecological Marxism. They might not have used the word ecology back in the 19th century, but it's an ecology in that it's a relational way of thinking, and it's an ongoing project, of course, that many more people have contributed to and debated, and that kind of continues onwards. So yeah, that's all I wanted to say.
Thanks, Camilla. So some of the contributors are being rather shy about speaking, but I will next take John Narayan, and then I'll take some questions from the chat. I'll just read them out, and the speakers can speak to them when they wrap up. So John.
Yeah, thank you. I'm not sure I actually chose to talk. I think I've been made to talk. But I'll do it. For those who don't know me, I wrote the chapter in the handbook on Huey P. Newton and the Black Panther Party. And in a sense, the chapter really starts with one of my favorite quotes from Huey P. Newton, which is about Marxist Lenin being stuck in class and through. What was it that? Did you read the chapter? Was it that bad? No, I'll start again. And it's about the idea that basically Marxist-Leninism cannot be static. Those of us who embrace a Marxist-Leninism that is static are actually not really Marxist-Leninists or not Marxists. In fact, we just practice a kind of flunkyism, right? And so that is the key part for how Marxism has developed over the last 200 years. is that it's a constantly evolving project that has been taken on and espoused in different contexts. So the idea that Marxism is Eurocentric is often very odd. So when we teach Marxism, we often get very, bright students go, "But that's a Eurocentric philosophy," and you're like, "Well, I'm going to teach you Marxism from the global South, from the Caribbean, from Africa, from Asia." Suddenly, it doesn't look so Eurocentric, right? But one of the big things that the Black Panther Party did, and I think this links back to what Kieran was saying, was the old institutions of how we organize in the 20th century have in many ways been weakened, right? Whether that's unionism, whether that's just the nature of employment, whether that's the way racism punctuates our idea of politics across the nation. And in a sense, what Marxism did for the Black liberation struggle via the Panthers was to say, we need to build new institutions. We need to build new institutions that can deal with the new realities of the working class. And that, in a sense, is where we're still at today. So it's amazing that we have all of these social movements of revolt, but the big question will be, what will be the institutions that we build that bring us together and unite ourselves in struggle, whether that's within the nation, beyond the nation, and across racial, gender, and class lines. All right, I'll leave it there.
Excellent, John. Thank you so much. Okay, so I will take a couple of questions from the chat. I'll just read them. One of the first ones was from Saskia Kronenberg. Could the editor's contributors elaborate on the distinction between Marxism and post-Marxism? How do these ways of thinking interact? And then one from Doreen Mende. Could the panel please say something about Marxism, socialism as a project of modernity with specific concern for the violence of universality as universality by whom? And also please elaborate on the relation between Marxism or socialism or internationalism in relation to decolonization. In other words, what would the panel think about the need for decolonizing socialism as a source of struggle for the planetary contemporary? A question from Hibist Casa. The unemployed, underemployed, peasantry, and informal economy are spaces that create different relations that exist within, alongside, parallel, and even against capital. The pastoral communities and nomad communities are always creating value in various forms. As Marxist production relations in these spheres and different forms of organizing are also crucial. So kind of a comment. And then I'll just take a couple more, and then perhaps I'll take a couple of contributions from the floor. So if the speakers could answer those at the very end. From Peter Dwyer, what does it really mean to the hundreds of millions of peasants, smallholders, own account workers, and peoples in and out of the informal sectors in countries like India, Nigeria, Indonesia, the citizens that Gayatri spoke of, to appeal to them as a working class? And then finally, Peter Burgess, much of the global struggle against capitalism involves people and movements whose worldviews are deeply rooted in religious faith. How should Marxists work with people and movements of faith in global transformation? And is it necessary for Marxists to be self-critical with regard to our own understanding for solidarities to flourish? So that's quite a few questions. So just to think about those, I'll take John Molyneux, and then if a couple of the contributors want to say something, I'll take you as well. So John.
Thank you very much, Maisie. I was going to ask Kieran Allen a question about James Connolly, but he's spoken already. So I'll say that what I'm going to say follows on very much from what Trevor and Gwani was saying, and in a way from what Kieran Allen was saying. And it is about the international working class. All my life and all my time in the movement, the predominant discourse, certainly in the academy, was that the working class somehow was a thing of the past. It was either disappearing, or it was being incorporated, or it was no longer, at any rate, a revolutionary subject. That was the dominant argument with even often from people who describe themselves as Marxists. It always strikes me when you look at the world, at the reality, that while all this discourse was going on, actually the working class was growing and is now infinitely larger force than it was in Marx's day or at any time in the past. Enormously larger force than it was at the time of the Russian Revolution. I mean, Marx was actually been proven correct that as capital grows, so does the proletariat, so does the working class. There are now, however you define it, hundreds of millions of workers in China, hundreds of millions in India, and so on. Millions upon millions in Africa. It doesn't, you know, we could have a long debate about who exactly is or isn't a worker, where the margins are, but however you define it, it is clear that this is enormously expanded. And here I want to agree with the point that Kieran was making, which is that we are in a period, an age of revolt, and that if you look particularly at the moments before the pandemic, there was a huge wave of mass revolts right across the world in country after country. Lebanon, Chile, Iraq, Ecuador, so on. I won't go through all the lists, often mobilizing millions upon millions of people. Inevitably, even if those were not seen as or presented as self-conscious movements of the working class, inevitably these were movements of working class people. And therefore, when we talk about facing the enormous challenges of the pandemic and climate change and the economic crisis, growing inequality and so on that everybody is referring to, I think socialists and Marxists have in this period a tremendous opportunity to relate to working class people in a way that we have not had for many generations, really going back to the great wave of surrounding the Russian Revolution and the end of the First World War. An opportunity to heal the rift that was created by the victories, the twin victories of Hitler and Stalin in the 30s. So I am an optimist about this, but we have to try and seize the opportunity in my opinion, because the potential is there. The working class of today, not only is it larger and potentially more powerful, it's also more feminine, it's also more multiracial, it is more open than ever before, I think, objectively. Thanks. To socialist ideas. Thank you, Faizi.
Great, thanks so much. That's useful. Okay, are there any contributors to the handbook that wanted to say a couple of words? You are more than welcome to raise your hand. And in the meantime, then, if there aren't any, I will take a couple of more questions that we had from the chat. One is from Nandini Sen. Digital development is one of the biggest tools of the capitalists. The COVID-19 pandemic globally has shown and reflected that digital divide and that it will produce generations of educationally starved young and adults in economically poorer countries. How should we solve this acute problem, especially in poorer countries, and also in terms of race and gender? And then she followed it up with another question just to say, how should we look at and support the huge current farmers' movements happening in India during this pandemic? This movement will go down in the history of the world. I think everyone can say something about that. And then from Majed Akhtar, to Gayatri Spivak, could you please say more about citizen as agent of social change, given this state-based relationship? What are the implications for internationalist socialism? And then from Radhika Saraf, given that the nation state is a bourgeois form, could you please elaborate on the citizen as the revolutionary subject? And if the framework of nation states rests on the declaration of the rights of man as citizen, in what ways can the Marxist project today challenge human rights discourse, which makes a distinction between man and citizen? Okay, so those are some more questions, and I just wondered, yeah, I just to call, I don't see any other hands. So, oh, okay. And I know that Christian Hosberg is one of the contributors. So if you'd like to speak for a couple of minutes, and then I'll take Leo.
Thanks, Faizi. Thanks, everyone. Real privileged to be here and speak. I wasn't going to speak, but you just kept calling for contributors to speak, so I kind of thought I would. I just wanted to do one thing, which just kind of show people physically the book, because it is absolute kind of monster, really, in sort of size and scale. Yeah, it's sort of tremendous thing, achievement. It's a brick, really. It's more than a brick. It's a I don't know, a building brick for building the future socialist society. I don't know. What I wanted to talk about was C.L.R. James a little bit, because that was my sort of contribution. And obviously it's C.L.R. James was born 120 years ago in Trinidad. So, you know, it was his 120th birthday nominally this year, if he's still been around. So, but if there's a new real resurgent, rightly, of interest in James and in his importance, for reasons kind of Alex was talking about, the same reasons that Du Bois has got a great deal of attention. He was one of the most important theorists, really, of relationship of capitalism and slavery in that tradition, and thinking about racism, colonialism, more broadly from a Marxist framework, and you know, coming out of the sort of Trotskyist tradition and building in some way, you know, in so many ways on Trotsky's History of Russian Revolution to write his great book Black Jacobins and so on. And there's, you know, it's fantastic that James has come really to the fore, really, thanks to the Black Lives Matter movement, really. But, you know, we've had the Stephen McQueen's fantastic Small Axe films, which people go and see, which talk, you know, which references the inspiration of Black Jacobins for Black Power movements in Britain, and Darkest How and the Mangrove 9 trial, and how it inspired people who were involved in Brixton riots in 1981, Alex Wheatle and so on. And but I guess it's one thing, I suppose, it's, you know, that Alex sort of alluded to was just, you know, if you think about how you diversify this, you know, think about this tradition. I mean, I suppose one thing about James was his theory was concerned with a period of state capitalism. Really, that was his great project, to try and think through that moment in the middle of the 20th century, 30s, 40s, 50s, analyze that on a global scale, think about the idea of state capitalism, as well as his contribution to Black liberation and theorizing that and anti-colonial, you know, colonial liberation. But thinking about that big process of state capitalism, I guess one thing about James was he never really properly theorized neoliberalism. He was too old on one level. But I guess one figure, and his writings on Africa in some ways on one level, because he was so intimately involved in part with the big early leaders of Pan-African liberation like Kwame Nkrumah and so on. He wasn't quite as critical of them as he could have been in the post-war period of decolonization. I think someone like Walter Rodney's importance there in terms of carrying on the best of that tradition of James, in terms of thinking about the African working class, and some of the questions, you know, Trevor Maguano was talking about there. I think Rodney would be one figure. I think, you know, as well as figures like Du Bois, figures. I mean, even Eric Williams thinking about capitalism and slavery is someone, you know, someone to think about. But also the much broader, writers who've come from the out of kind of Black liberation struggles towards revolutionary Marxism. I think there's a great opportunity with the Black Lives Matter movement to have real, you know, engaged arguments again and actually win a potential new generation of Black radicals to the ideas of revolutionary Marxism by recovering some of that rich political tradition. Okay, thanks.
Thanks, Christian. So next we'll hear from Leo Zelig, and then I'll take a few more questions from the chat. The speakers.
Okay, hi. Thanks a lot. I just wanted to echo something that Alex said right at the start of his presentation, which is perhaps what signals the satisfaction or the success of this dictionary is that you pick it up, this handbook rather, that you pick it up and you delight in the contributions, but you also rage about what's not in there. And I think that is a sign of how engaged it is, and also its readers. And I think, of course, one of the obvious absences is Walter Rodney, a great Marxist, as Christian has just said. I wrote a short contribution essay on Frantz Fanon. And as many of you know, Frantz Fanon is the incredibly important thinker, really, of the 60s and 70s and on, figurehead of the Black Lives Matter movement, and a thinker, an activist of remarkable subtlety and complexity. And he did a whole number of things which it's vital for us, particularly in a handbook like this, to be discussing. He managed through the appalling blockage of Stalinism, and without being or considering himself a Marxist, to work out concepts of national liberation and revolution, and essentially political and economic struggle across national boundaries, without the help of the Marxist, the classical Marxist toolbook, and of Trotsky in particular, although he read Trotsky to some extent. So with ferocious originality, he manages to start asking the questions before anyone else does, really, about the limits of decolonization and the possibilities of what he described as universal emancipation once the European working class stopped playing their game of Sleeping Beauty, as he persuasively and beautifully put it. But there were other problems which it's important to embrace. And because he wrote his last book, The Wretched of the Earth, in such a hurry, it was a draft, really, of course, because he was dying in the year that he was writing it. He's very confused about class. So he talks about the peasantry as being the real wretched of the earth, the poorest of the poor. And of course, it was the ideas of the lumpen proletariat that Huey P. Newton celebrated in the later 1960s, a fantastic reader, interpreter of Fanon in many ways. But he ditches the working class very much as an agent of possible progressive transformation. But however, this deep and complex involvement with Marxism explicitly, but more often around the rim of those Marxist debates, makes Fanon, I think, an important addition to this dictionary, and a very exciting and important thinker today.
Thank you, Leo. That's great. Okay, so I'm going to read a few more contributions from the chat. I've got about roughly 10 minutes, and then I'm going to ask the panelists to come back. So from Kishore Birdekar for Gayatri Spivak, how do we react to the idea of value generation being used in the work of development as a main source or idea of social change? Value here is completely dehistoricized. How can we link Marxist ideas of value to the work of development? And then from Surya Parekh, can Gayatri talk about the difference between nociology and epistemology that she discusses in her chapter Global Marx in relation to learning to use Marx? And then from Alpesh Maisuria, what are the general views of the contributors on MMT, modern monetary theory, and also new materialism? And then just a few more. Adam Wadley, my question arises from a course I'm in on civil war. Can anyone mention work which addresses the homology between civil war and class struggle, or other Marxist theorizing on civil war? And then from H. Friedman, the 2020s will be the most turbulent decade in the history of our species. First, capitalism is facing increasing difficulties reproducing itself, as evidenced by the fall in the rate of profit beginning in China in 2011, followed by the US in 2014, hence the collapse in longer-term global investment. Second, the march of the robots, machine learning leading to 40% unemployment. Third, global warming. Fourth, the hegemonic struggle between the US and China. The crisis of capitalism is our opportunity for change. Perhaps you can comment on that. And finally, from Rob Stewart, Trevor, you're right. We need to dream. We have a problem, though. The mainstream media, which is owned by a handful of millionaires who will not permit any alternative vision to be promoted or discussed. The status quo is asserted as the only option, which is madness given the reality of our desperate situation. Social media allows alternative visions to be shared, but without due editorial process, conspiracy theories and lies are everywhere. Would you agree that the breakdown of reliable information is a leading contributing factor in the rise of disillusionment and disengagement where it exists, and that structural power inherent in the MSM in particular must be addressed as a matter of urgency? So those are some of the questions from the chat. I would also like to call once again, if there are any contributors to the handbook who want to speak for 2 to 3 minutes, and then I will bring the panelists back to comment on all of those questions or any of them that they choose. Did Paul LeBlanc want to speak? Sorry, he hasn't got his hand up, but and also Rick Kuhn. Okay, so I'll take Paul LeBlanc and then I'll take Rick Kuhn. Paul.
There are several things I want to say. I think that the title of the handbook is misleading and a disaster, because if you try to use it as a handbook, you'll hurt your hand. You need both hands. It is so large and it's so full of all kinds of great stuff. I think it's a wonderful resource. And at the same time, I've been troubled as I've been thinking about it and listening, and I want to share that with you. The nature of Marxism, I remember something I read from Trotsky a long time ago, that said essentially, if you're not involved in the working class and building the working class movement and so forth, then the Marxism doesn't make any sense, something like that, which is something that I've felt all my life. And so can we bring the changes that we're talking about that we need? It seems to me that's the point of Marxism. I'm frustrated and have been frustrated and feel an intense frustration over that question. The kind of mass working class movements and the possibility of revolution coming from that seemed to exist at the time of Luxemburg or Trotsky, that hasn't existed. We've got to build it, we've got to rebuild it. But then there are the crises that are coming in that pose the question, do we have time? Do we have time to build what needs to be built to bring about what we need? That's not clear to me. So that's a profound frustration, and I can have interesting intellectual discussions with people about the kinds of things we're talking about, but how can we get it to click in a way that brings about actual change and opens up possibilities for change? And it's seemed at various times like, oh, here's a possibility, and then it's squashed, or here's a possibility and it discredits itself. So that's a question that's posed in my mind. I have had a sense in certain other countries, sometimes in my own, fleetingly, oh my God, they're doing something in Ireland. Oh, this amazing thing has happened in India or South Africa, or there's a need to have not just an international discussion like this, but it seems to me some kind of something, I'm not sure what, that can help to bring the theory in line with practice, socialism and the working class coming together in a way that does bring hope for the future. So as I'm thinking about things, as I'm listening to this, as I'm engaging with the handbook, that's something that that's a challenge that I'm feeling, that troubles me, because I don't have an honest answer to that. So those are my thoughts. That's it.
Thanks, Paul. Okay, so I'll finally take Rick Kuhn, and then possibly one more question from the chat, and then we'll have time for Gayatri and then Trevor and either Lucia or Stathis Kouvelakis, if he's here, to finally wrap up the event. So, Rick. Rick, we can't hear you. No, we can't. Do you perhaps, yeah, or do you want to put your question in the chat if that's possible? And I can read it out. Okay, so if Rick might be able to sort his audio out, and in the meantime, I'll take a couple of questions from the chat. So from Gonzalez Carmen, could you further elaborate, this is for Gayatri, could you further elaborate on the role of affects in capitalism? You talked about greed, violence, and fear driving capitalism's dark side. In Central America and Mexico, there is a phenomenon of extreme violence establishing capitalist markets in the field of death and violence. This coming from the sector of the population that has completely been excluded from capitalist exploitation and is searching for social mobility through something that can be described as necro-empowerment. How could we address this specific problem? And then there's another one from Roberto Gorace. Can you please elaborate about the validity of the concept of real abstraction? I think it can be very useful to frame the progressive computerization and intellectualization of work. And I think that's all. So Rick, I'm not sure if you've had a chance to sort your audio out. If you haven't, I can see one more hand from Lawrence Wong. So Lawrence, if you can be very brief, I'll take you, and then we will move to the panelists to wrap up.
Can you say something about the Taliban as citizen? Because it seems to me for 20 years, NATO has fought the Taliban to peace talks. So the Taliban fighters must be over the moon, not at all depressed. So what is the citizen for a Taliban fighter?
Okay, thanks, Lawrence. Yes, if just someone was saying, if Rick, you can sort your mic out, I'd be happy to take you before the end of the, oh, maybe we can hear you.
Hello.
Yes. Okay, that's great. You're on.
Yeah, I didn't want to ask a question. I want to be presumptuous in a way I think that Leninists are in answering one, and that is about the issue of there are so many crises of capitalism. This is a fantastic opportunity. Well, I think that's true, but as Paul LeBlanc said, there are circumstances in which opportunities can be taken advantage of better than others. And crucially, to take advantage of these crises to transform the responses of people to crisis, the struggles that have arisen in response to the crisis into revolution, requires revolutionary organisation, requires revolutionary parties with roots in the working class. Well, and they don't exist. Well, we need to make them. We need to make them exist. We need to be part of revolutionary organisations that aren't parties rooted in the working class and try and build them into that. Henrik Grossman, about who I wrote a contribution to the handbook, was very clear about this, although he's been portrayed as a theorist of automatic or mechanical breakdown of capitalism. He drew on Lenin. He said Lenin had it right. In order for the revolution to occur, it was necessary not only that vast numbers of people need to feel that change is necessary and for the ruling class to be unclear about its way forward, it was also necessary to have that subjective factor. And that subjective factor is a revolutionary party of the working class. So yes, the handbook, I think, can be a weapon, an ideological weapon, but I'd like to see people who look at it transform it into a physical weapon as well, not to belay members of the ruling class immediately about the head, to move into armed struggle, armed with the physical object of the handbook, but to look forward to that kind of struggle in the future by helping to build revolutionary currents distinct from reformism that are committed to the self-emancipation of the working class.
Thanks so much, Rick. That was worth waiting for. Okay, so I'd like to then call on Gayatri and Trevor, and perhaps Lucia could say then a few words at the very end for 5 minutes each, just so we can finish the launch at 5 p.m. You don't have to take the whole 5 minutes, and obviously answer what you feel you want to answer. So Gayatri. Gayatri, you're on mute.
Okay, post-Marxism. I don't really know what post-Marxism is, but Alex called me a post-Marxist. So I would say that, like many things, post-Marxism is well theorized by Marx and Engels in the 1872 edition of the Communist Manifesto, the introduction that they wrote. They said not to read the parts of the revolution, parts on the revolution seriously anymore, because big business, I'm almost quoting verbatim because I tell my students to read that all the time. Big business has moved so far in 25 years, big business, they say, 25 years, that all of the revolutionary stuff that they wrote is veraltet. In other words, too old, out of, no longer useful. And they say that we have kept it as we have because it's become a historical icon. I think the brothers are telling us how to use them. In other words, move with the way in which capital as such moves and use us historically. That's, I suppose, for me, post-Marxism. I don't think of myself as a post-Marxist, I think of myself as a Marxist. So therefore, that's what I'll say about post-Marxism. You cut me off on 5 minutes, okay? I didn't look at the time.
I will. Thanks.
I think the biggest question that people have asked me is the question about citizenship. See, the thing is that Leo Zelig, when he talked about Fanon, he was right on the spot. In that chapter 2, I think, or 3, where he's talking about post-colonial nations, the limits of decolonization, he has a complete, he thinks the leaders, and he uses the English word, he thinks the leaders are the worst thing in so-called post-colonial states. He didn't even see this, but he described the misuse of democracy as body count completely. And the so-called, really para-paternalistic states, which are which are supposedly used in democratic formation today, where democracy is only body count. That's why I was talking about citizenship. Marx says now, of course, bourgeois for us has become a bad word, but the word is bürgerlich, right, for Marx, and Bürger, that is a citizen. So to an extent, what the bourgeois revolution did, if you think of the Marseillaise, they called the sokilote citoyen. That was the big thing. So, but that was not enough. And so Marx says the task of the bourgeois, the bürgerliche Gesellschaft, is to establish the world market. This is This is what the citizen, this is what the bürgerliche Gesellschaft does. Now, in our time, the voter as body count, it's the hugest sector of the electorate. That's why I so agree with Molyneux that you cannot keep Marxism at the universities. Everybody talks the talk. That's why I tried, they don't walk the walk. That's why I tried to step away from the book and talk about the limits of my little activism, where you begin to learn that your learning is a hampering thing. This kind of competitive scholarship where you are correct and you're correct and you're being a correct Marxist, it hampers you. You cannot talk to the largest sector of the electorate. Fanon knew this, that because of the class apartheid in education, they in fact bring in the tyrants that are so-called democracy, voting, arithmetical democracy, voting as body count. They bring in the tyrants who rule the world today.
That's 5 minutes, Gayatri.
Good. So therefore, I will say citizenship is the only social contract that we have. We must question citizenship in a nation state as we use citizenship in order to generalize, because global capitalism calls itself post-national, but the measurement of development is nation state by nation state. There's much more to say, but 5 minutes is 5 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you so much. That's excellent. So next we'll hear from Trevor. 5 minutes, Trevor. Thanks.
Okay, please tell me when it's 5 minutes.
I will do.
Okay. Firstly, I want to say that there are certain problems which derive from within the working class movement. So it's not about Marxism or even about the bourgeoisie, but it's problems and challenges within our movement. So, for example, you get trade unions and working class parties, you know, where many years of bosses politics has entered deeper and deeper. You know, you get workers who see for many years their leaders carrying the message of bosses to workers rather than of the workers to bosses. You get worker leaders who talk about laws from parliament, ignoring the laws of working class life. And then you get workers who don't feel that they belong in their own organizations, in their own unions. So they don't feel that they have a place in their organizations, a place where they can be at home, where they can raise ideas, any demand, any suggestion, any question, any criticism. So those workers are there, you know, physically, you know, in the collective, but they are alone. So there's those problems you can address within the movement, you know, and then another thing which maybe is partly related is that there is nothing as strong, as inspiring, and which will change your life if you are part of it, as a workers' movement on the move, fighting behind its demands, fighting, you know, behind the vision of alternatives. You know, there's just, you know, nothing greater than that, you know, for social change. So now we find that there are now generations of people, youth, who have never seen this, who have never known the meaning of workers' democracy, who have never seen workers' power in their own lives. So they've never felt that strength and hope of a mobilized working class movement, broadly defined working class movement, a mass movement. So they have never been allowed that vision, you know, that together we can make a different future. Okay, people got a taste of that a bit with Black Lives Matter, but we know that, you know, the organized labor was not there. Workers, if they were there, you know, under their own individual cognizances. So it is in those contexts that the socialist vision, you know, gets dim, where hope gets trampled upon, and then you know, you get ideas that, you know, there can be no future. And another important point is that it's so easy, you know, for the older generation to convey to the younger generation despair, dashed hopes, rather than to convey the heroism, determination, and sacrifice and hope which they felt, you know, during their struggles. It's what's happening in South Africa. You know, guys my age, they were there in the 80s. We live that, we thrive on that, but we're not conveying it, you know, to the youth. You know, we just tell them how we're sold out. So, you know, this leads to a situation where, you know, when things which were possible in the past did not happen, maybe it's missed opportunities, maybe it's bad tactics, then people say it was impossible. It was never going to happen. So this is very important. And then my last point.
That's 5 minutes. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, it's 5 minutes. You can make your last point.
Okay, my last point is that South Africa was once known for many years now, recently, in post-apartheid, as the protest capital of the world. And then in 2011, the Arab Spring came, and then the attention shifted. So the point is that when the people were protesting in South Africa, there was no notion of regime change. You know, it was just demanding from the government. But even with the Arab Spring, when, you know, the regimes Mubarak fell, there was no notion of replacing, you know, that power with grassroots power, working class power. So in the end, it becomes a call for free and fair elections. So what I'm trying to say is that sometimes we struggle, but instead of trying to grab power for the masses, we cede, we give away power. So I think it's important also to look at, and then, you know, what happens is that the new regimes, they're just there to nurse and make sure that exhausted bourgeois democracy, capitalist regimes, in the name of equality and free and fair elections, thrive. So we need a vision of alternatives, taking the power to ordinary people on the ground.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Trevor. So finally, we're here from Lucia, one of the editors of the Handbook.
First of all, I wanted to thank everyone for coming this evening. It's been really amazing to listen to all of you. And I just wanted to start with what Trevor said at the beginning, and I think he's right that one of the kind of ideas behind this handbook has been to look at Marxist ideas and Marxism as a theory that tries to understand capitalism as a totality, and in doing so tries to look beyond capitalism, and so becomes also a tool of struggle to dream and also create a different future. And I think that the kind of variety and the richness of the contributions want to kind of go beyond some reductionist interpretations of a Marxist theory of exploitation, and really showed that what Gayatri Spivak called the theft of surplus value, and understanding the mechanisms behind this theft of surplus value is really the way in which workers can get empowered and learn about their collective power and see that capitalism in the end, it's their own creation, and therefore they can learn about their transformative power as well. And I think it's important to bear in mind that Marx wasn't talking just about factory workers, but also was trying to analyze the ways in which exploitation, capitalist exploitation, is intertwined with continuing processes of primitive accumulation. And so the expropriation of direct producers, peasants, state and colonial violence continue alongside, don't just continue alongside exploitation, but are also shaped and shape labor exploitation. And I think that what we're witnessing today is quite an example of this, the way in which colonial and imperialist violence are expanding a global reserve army of unemployed and underemployed workers that are at the same time mobilized by the forces of accumulation, and at the same time trapped by new mechanisms of global apartheid that also fuel racism in the global system. And so I think this kind of analysis help us looking at capitalism as a global system. It's also helping us to see the way in which struggles in the workplace around wages, working conditions, working times are linked to struggles over dispossession, social reproduction, ecology, imperialism, and racism. And also, I think the reflections by Marx himself show how the support for the struggles of the most marginalized and oppressed by the organized workers is key for the movement to go ahead. And I think that it's on this terrain of struggle really that the deep organic link between production and reproduction and the globality of Marxist thought becomes concrete when diversity becomes solidarity and radicalism in the struggle. And I think that just to conclude, this point is quite important going back to the debate because it allows us to see the current age as an age both of catastrophe and global revolt. And I think that the COVID-19 pandemic is really bringing this kind of contradictions to the fore because it's showing the consequences of a ecological system that is based on dispossession, ecological degradation and deforestation, and is creating the conditions for these pandemics to spread. And so I think that looking at the kind of roots of the current pandemic is important because it helps us link struggles around the workplaces. So for safe jobs, to protect our jobs, to protect our working conditions, how these struggles are linked to the struggles against dispossession, against marketization of rural relations like what's going on in India. Right now, which should give a sense of hope and power to the workers around the world and just realize how powerful we can be. And I think what's the problem right now is that many parties and also trade unions are not emphasizing the power that we have, how capital is dependent on our own power, but they're emphasizing the weaknesses and vulnerabilities. And I think that adopting a global approach and looking at these kind of connections between struggles is really important to go to the roots of the problems, but also to develop a global response that allows us to reappropriate our power right now. So I hope that even if it is not possible to carry the handbook with just one hand, well, this will be a tool for present and future generations to think about the way forward together.
Excellent. Thank you, Lucia, and thanks to all the editors, and thanks to all the contributors and everyone who came. This has been a brilliant launch, and congratulations again to the editors and the contributors of the handbook. I just wanted to say that the seminar in contemporary Marxist theory, again, the people who organized this book launch is organized by a network of scholars at King's College London, LSE, Queen Mary, Loughborough University, and the University of Greenwich. And the next seminar will be in 2 weeks' time on Wednesday, the 3rd of March from 4:15 to 6:15. And the title of that seminar will be Neoliberalism and Empire, Latin American and Eastern European Perspectives. And there'll be 3 panelists, Quinn Slobodian discussing his book Globalists, The End of Empire and the Birth of Neoliberalism. Also Virginia Fontes from Universidade Federal Fluminense in Brazil. And Balaz, I hope I'm pronouncing this correctly, Balaz Trensenyi from Central European University. So that's in 2 weeks' time at 4:15, and you're all more than welcome to come. Thanks everyone for coming again. And again, that recording will be on the Facebook page, as I understand it, of the seminar in Contemporary Marxist Theory. Thanks again, everyone.
Thanks very much, Dr. Spivak and Ngwani, and you, Faisy, for sharing.
For a wonderful, wonderful discussion I want to speak now for 2 hours, but I don't think it's possible. I want to respond to everyone.
Thanks very much.
I think you're a Marxist.
Apologies for mislabeling you.
You discovered at the end of a handbook on Marxism and Post Marxism that you mislabeled her, Alex.
I know. Well, it was worth doing it to discover that.
That's all right. You were irritated by Pomo, but you did not think that I was one of them, because I'm not in that book, thank God. I bought it in 1991. In fact, it's right here.
Great. Thank you very much.
It's
Thanks,
really
everyone.
fun. It's really fun, I must say.